Read chapter 3 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle today, and my dogs are here in the house, so if you see them rustling around, think nothing of it. Alright, so yesterday's cure was the won't pick up toys cure, and we found out how Mrs. Piggle Wiggle got Hubert to finally start picking up his toys. So today, we have the answer backer cure. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. O'Toole put a peanut butter sandwich and a nice cool glass of milk on the kitchen table for her little girl when she came home from school. Pretty soon, the front door slammed and in bounced Mary, her red braids bouncing around like little ponytails. Her mother said, "How was school, darling?" Mary said as she gulped her milk and took a large bite of the sandwich, "Well, this afternoon, Miss Crabtree said Mary O'Toole will stay in at recess and put the paint boxes away. And I said," as she took another gulp of milk, "You're the teacher here, Miss Crabtree. Why don't you put away the paint boxes and let me go out and play?" Everybody in the whole room laughed, but mean old Miss Crabtree didn't, and she sent me into the coat room. Mary took another large bite and looked up at her mother expectantly to see if she would appreciate how smart she was. However, her mother said, "That was a very rude thing for you to do, Mary, and I am ashamed of you. When you finish your sandwich and milk, you better go up to your room and stay until dinner. You can concentrate on how rude you were to nice Miss Crabtree." Mary pulled her mouth down at the corners, meaning she frowned, and said, "Why should I?" She kept her mouth in a frown and blinked her eyes rapidly in a most disagreeable way. Mrs. O'Toole was completely dumbfounded. Never had her little Mary acted in this horrid way before. She said quietly, "You should because I tell you to. Now scat." Mary walked slowly out of the kitchen, switching her skirt and her braids and managing to look impudent even from the back. When she reached the top of the stairs, she called down to her mother, "I'm going because I want to, but not because you tell me to," and dashed into her room and slammed the door. That night at dinner, Mary was quite normal acting, but after dinner, her daddy said, "Take the dishes off the table, young lady. Your mom is tired." And his dear little lady, instead of jumping up and doing what she was told, frowned again until she looked like a sad jack-o'-lantern, squinted her eyes up, and said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Anyway, you eat here. Why don't you clear the table?" She blinked her eyes rapidly. "Ooh, she's got an attitude, doesn't she?" Her father looked as though he might be going to give her a spanking, but then he noticed it was time for the news, so instead he went into his study, turned on the radio, and lit his pipe. Mary did clear off the table, and she dried the dishes, but she kept blinking her eyes and muttering. Next morning, her mother said, "Please hurry with your breakfast, Mary. The children are waiting, and you'll make them late for school." Mary pulled her mouth down and began blinking. She said, "I'm the one that's eating this breakfast, madam." She pronounced it matum. Mary's mother sighed and said, "If you only knew how unattractive you look when you talk like that, you would stop right now." Mary mumbled something into her mush, then grabbed her sweater and slammed the front door. Mrs. O'Toole went to the telephone and called her friend, Mrs. Rags. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Rags. Have you noticed any change in Calliope lately?" Mrs. Rags said, "Well, no, can't say I have, Mrs. O'Toole. She seems to be studying hard in school, and she eats and sleeps well. Have you noticed anything wrong with her?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "No, it's not Calliope I'm worried about. It's Mary. Yesterday afternoon she came home from school and she seemed perfectly normal and she looked all right, but she told me how very impudent she had been in school. I punished her, of course. In fact, I sent her to her room to stay until dinner, but she was awful to me. She was rude to her father, too. I just can't understand it. I thought perhaps all the children were acting this way. She frowns, squints her eyes, and blinks. She looks hideous." Mrs. Rags said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Toole, because Mary has always been such a dear little girl. I don't know what to suggest. Why don't you call Mrs. Keystop? You know what a problem her little Chucky is. She may have some ideas." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Thank you very much, Mrs. Rag. I'll call Mrs. Keystop right now." So she called Mrs. Keystop, but she wasn't at home, and the maid Nora answered the phone. Nora said, "Sure, and Mrs. Keystop ain't home, Miss O'Toole, but how is it that dear little Mary The one with the beautiful braids? Mrs. O'Toole said, "Oh, Nora, that's why I called. Mary has suddenly become so awful. She answers back, and she frowns and squints up her eyes and blinks. She started yesterday, and I am so upset. I called Mrs. Keystop to see if she's had any similar trouble with Chucky." Nora said, "No, there's not any trouble she's had like that with Chucky. And sure, there ain't any trouble she hasn't had with Chucky. He's so rude he talks back to himself. But I'm thinking you better call Mrs. Piggle. That little woman has forgotten more about children than we'll ever know. She even taught Hubert to pick up his toys. Now there's a spoiled child." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Oh, thank you so much, Nora. I should have thought of Mrs. Piggle in the first place. I'll call her right now." Mrs. O'Toole called Mrs. Piggle and said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle, I am so worried about my little girl Mary." Mrs. Piggle said, "I know Mary. She has beautiful red hair and lovely brown eyes." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Well, she still has the hair anyway, but her eyes don't look pretty anymore. She squints 'em up, frowns, and then blinks." Mrs. Piggle said, "She answers back and is impudent, isn't she?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "Yes, she is, but how did you know?" "I do hope she hasn't been this rude to you." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, no, Mary's always very polite to me, but I can recognize the answer-backer symptoms. When was she first rude?" "Yesterday afternoon, right after school. She was rude to dear Miss Crabtree, her teacher, and when I sent her to her room, she made this hideous face and said, 'I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to.' Mrs. Piggle, she walks in such a way that her braids twitch and even her back looks impudent." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Some of the most charming children I know were once answer-backers. Fortunately, Mary has only just begun, so she can be cured in no time at all. You drop by here after lunch, and I'll give you Penelope Parrot to keep for a while. Mrs. Garrison has been using Penelope, but she's had her for a month now, and Gary should be cured by this time. Now, don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Penelope is a cure for even the most stubborn cases of answer-backishness." Mrs. O'Toole hung up the phone, and she felt much better. Right after lunch, she went down to Mrs. Piggle's house and got Penelope. Penelope Parrot was a large, cross-looking green bird who blinked rapidly. Mrs. Piggle said as she handed the cage to Mrs. O'Toole, "Fortunately for you, Penelope will only talk to children." During the walk home from Mrs. Piggle's house, Penelope was quiet in a very cross, blinky-eyed sort of way. And when Mrs. O'Toole hung her cage in the kitchen, she hunched down and put her head under her wing. But when Mary came in from school, Penelope woke up and began cleaning and preening her feathers. Mary was delighted with Penelope. She said, "Oh, Mother, I've always wanted a parrot. Do you think she can talk?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "She hasn't said a word since I brought her home, but I was told she only speaks to children." Mary said, "Where did you get her, Mother? Is she for me? May I have her in my room for my very own?" Her mother said, "I'm keeping her for a friend of mine, but when you play in your room, you may hang her cage by the window." Mary brought her milk and cookies over by Penelope's cage and was very surprised when Penelope blinked and said rudely, "Give me a bite, pig." Mary broke off a piece of the cookie and poked it through the bars of the cage. Penelope snatched it and said, "Thanks, pig." Mary turned to her mother. "She's certainly not very polite, is she?" Her mother said, "Perhaps she's been around rude people. After all, she's only a parrot and repeats what she hears." Penelope blinked her eyes and said, "Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah?" Mrs. O'Toole looked a little shocked, but Mary laughed and said, "May I bring the children in to see her, Mother? May I?" Zoe, are you enjoying the book? Before Mrs. O'Toole could answer, Penelope began hopping up and down, blinking and yelling, "Say, are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here?" Mary's mother said, "I am the boss around here, Penelope, and if you are not more courteous, I'll put a cloth over your cage." Penelope blinked and muttered. Mary bounced up and down excitedly. "What will that do, Mother? What will that do to Penelope?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "If I put a cloth over her cage, she'll think it's night and go to sleep." Penelope squawked, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to." Mary was certainly surprised at that because she thought that she had made up that brilliant remark. She didn't dare look at her mother, so she put on her sweater and went out to find her friends. Pretty soon she came back with 5 little friends, and they spent the afternoon standing around Penelope's cage and laughing at her rude remarks. This worried Mrs. O'Toole. If Mary thought Penelope was so amusing, then perhaps she would imitate her and become ruder than ever. So she called Mrs. Pigglewiggle. She said in a low voice so the children in the kitchen would not hear, "Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I'm rather worried, because although Penelope is very rude to the children, they don't mind at all. Mary thinks she's funny and laughs at everything she says." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Just remember, Mrs. O'Toole, that this is only the first day with Penelope. Let Mary be with her as much as she wishes. Keep Penelope's cage in the breakfast nook when Mary eats her lunch and breakfast, and in the dining room at night. Hang her cage in Mary's bedroom when she goes up there to play, and have Penelope sleep in Mary's room. I'm sure you don't have to worry. Penelope's never failed me." Mrs. O'Toole said, "All right, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I'll do just as you say. Goodbye." Just before dinner, Mrs. O'Toole said to Mary, "Mary, dear, send your little friends home now. It's time for you to set the table." Mary turned to her mother and began pulling down her mouth, squinting her eyes, and blinking. But before she could say a word, Penelope yelled out, "Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss around here? Who's the boss anyway?" Mary's mother quickly put a cloth over her cage, politely asked the children to leave, and sent Mary in to set the table. When Mr. O'Toole came home from the office, she took the cover off again to show him the parrot, and then she hung Penelope in the dining room window. After dinner, Mary's daddy said, "Up on your toes, Miss Molly O'Toole, and scoot those dishes out to the kitchen." Mary pulled down her mouth in a frown, squinted up her eyes, blinked her eyes, but Penelope said, "What am I, a servant? Work, work, work. What am I, a servant? Say, who's the boss around here?" Mary's daddy laughed so hard the tears ran down his cheeks. But Mary stuck out her tongue at Penelope, who bounced around yelling, "Only snakes stick out their tongues! Only snakes stick out their tongues!" Mary pulled her tongue in quickly and shut her lips together tight. My, but she thought Penelope was horrid. Mrs. O'Toole hung Penelope's cage in Mary's room, and Penelope squawked and made so much noise that Mary finally said, "Oh, be quiet!" And Penelope blinked and said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to." Mary flounced into bed and turned off the light. The next morning, Mary was very slow. She could not find one of her socks, and she couldn't button her dress, and finally her mother called, "Mary, hurry, dear, breakfast is waiting." Mary pulled down her mouth into a frown and squinted up her eyes and said, "Oh, hurry, 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 hurry yourself." Penelope had been preening her tail feathers, but when she heard Mary, she jerked her head up and said, "Oh, hurry, 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 hurry yourself, Slowpoke, hurry yourself, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, 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 hurry." Mary said crossly, "Oh, be quiet, Penelope." Penelope said, "I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Say, who's the boss around here? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah?" Mary ran downstairs and sat down to breakfast, leaving Penelope still shouting. But Mrs. O'Toole ran upstairs and got Penelope and hung her cage by the kitchen window. When the children called for Mary, and Mrs. O'Toole said, "Hurry, dear, you'll make your friends late for school," Mary pulled down her mouth into a frown and squinted up her eyes and blinked. But before she could say a word, Penelope squawked, "I'm the one who's eating this breakfast, madam. Hurry, hurry, hurry. That's all I hear. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke." Mary was ashamed to look at her mother, so she rushed off without kissing her goodbye. Penelope yelled after her, "Hurry, Slowpoke, bell's ringing, bell's ringing." When Mary came home from school that afternoon, she kissed her mother and said, "Mother, I apologized to Mrs. Crabtree today, and she said that next week I can be the scissor monitor." Penelope yelled, "Who said so? Who said so? Who said so? Who's the boss? Who's the boss?" Mary turned to Penelope and said, "You are a very rude bird. If you don't hush right now, I will put the cloth over your cage." Penelope blinked and said, "Hush, hush, hush. That's all I hear. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Who's the boss around here anyway?" Mary's mother said, "I am the boss, and I think it's time you went home, Penelope. Mary, would you like to return Penelope to Mrs. Pigglewiggle?" Mary said, "Oh, yes, Mother. And may I stay and play?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "I think you'd better come home and practice. Your music lesson is tomorrow, you know." Mary started to draw down her mouth, squint up her eyes, and blink, but suddenly she looked at Penelope, and so she turned up her mouth in a smile, opened her eyes, and did smile. She said, "All right, Mother, I'll come home right after I return that rude Penelope." So we learned all about the answer backer cure, and all it took was a parrot.